The nurse my daughter paid suddenly spilled all my pills across my kitchen table, and as she knelt to gather them, she pressed her hand over mine and whispered, "They want you gone." I did not move. I did not breathe. I only stared at the small white and pink tablets rolling across the oak table my husband had sanded with his own hands 30 years before. And I understood, in that instant, that my life had quietly become something I no longer recognized. My name is Eleanor Hartwell. I am 71 years old, and until that Tuesday morning in March, I believed the greatest danger left in my life was loneliness. I had already buried my husband. I had already learned to sleep on one side of a bed built for two. I thought I understood loss completely. I did not understand yet that loss could also be engineered, scheduled, and signed for in triplicate by people who called me Mom. If you have ever had to stand your ground against your own family, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight, because I promise you, by the end of this, you will understand exactly why I needed to hear from someone else that I was not imagining things. The nurse's name was Marisol Reyes. She was 34 years old, quiet, careful, with dark hair always pulled back so tightly it looked like it hurt, and hands that moved with the practiced gentleness of someone who had spent a decade tending to bodies that no longer entirely belonged to their owners. My daughter Diane had hired her 4 months earlier, right after what everyone in my family now referred to, delicately, as the fall. Marisol came 6 days a week, arriving at 7 in the morning in a gray sedan with a rosary hanging from the mirror, and she left every evening at 7, and in between she measured my pills into a plastic organizer with 7 little compartments, one for each day God gave a person to get through. That morning, her hand had been shaking. I noticed it before I noticed anything else, because Marisol Reyes did not shake. Not when my blood pressure spiked. Not when I fell asleep mid-sentence at the kitchen table, a symptom she and I both quietly knew had no business appearing in a woman who, until 3 years ago, still climbed a stepladder to clean her own gutters. Her hand shook that morning as she reached for the organizer, and the plastic lid caught wrong, and 42 pills in 6 different colors scattered across the table and onto the floor like something had finally broken loose inside the both of us. She did not apologize the way she usually did. She dropped to her knees instead, gathering pills into her palm with quick, practiced fingers. And when her face came level with mine beneath the table, she said it. 4 words. "They want you gone." Then she straightened up as if nothing had happened at all, set the organizer gently back on the table, and asked me, in her ordinary Tuesday voice, whether I wanted my tea with honey or without. I told her without. My hands were shaking too badly to hold a spoon steady, and I did not want her to see that. I want to tell you plainly, because I promised myself a long time ago that I would never again let anyone else narrate my own life for me, that I was not always the woman sitting at that table, frightened of her own tea. I was a woman who ran a household of 4 on a contractor's income and never once went into debt. I was a woman who balanced her checkbook to the penny every single month for 48 years. I raised 1 daughter, buried 2 parents, buried a husband, and never, not once, needed anyone to explain to me what was best for me. And yet here I was, 71 years old, sitting in my own kitchen, waiting for a stranger paid by my own child to tell me the truth, because I could no longer trust the people who shared my blood to tell it to me themselves. To understand how a woman ends up here, you have to go back 3 years, to the January my husband Walter's heart simply stopped beating in the garage while he was oiling a hinge on a cabinet he'd been meaning to fix for a decade. You have to go back to the version of my daughter who used to call every single Sunday just to hear my voice, not to check whether I'd remembered to lock the back door. You have to go back to before, because everything that happened after only makes sense once you understand exactly what was lost and exactly who decided to profit from the losing. Walter Hartwell built our house himself, board by board, on a half-acre lot on Maple Ridge Lane, back when the whole street was still gravel, and the developer hadn't yet decided the town was worth paving. He was a contractor his whole working life, the kind of man who believed a foundation poured wrong would haunt a house for 100 years, and he treated our marriage the same way. Steady, load-bearing, built to outlast whatever weather came through. When he died, I did not just lose a husband. I lost the person who had, for 46 years, stood between me and every hard decision the world tried to hand me alone. Diane was 43 when her father died. She flew in from 3 states away, stayed 11 days, cried at the funeral in a way that seemed, at the time, entirely real, and then flew home again, promising to call every week. She did call every week, for a while. And then the calls started arriving with an agenda attached. Small at first, almost invisible, the way water finds the first hairline crack in a foundation, long before anyone notices the wall has started to lean. "Mom, have you thought about downsizing?" she asked me, maybe 4 months after the funeral, her voice light, casual, the voice of a daughter simply making conversation. I told her no, that I had raised her in that house, that her father had built it with his own hands, that I intended to die in it exactly the way he had died in the garage attached to it, and I did not appreciate being asked twice in one season. She laughed it off. "I just worry about you rattling around in there alone," she said. I remember thinking, even then, that worry and control wear remarkably similar clothing, and it takes a sharp eye to tell them apart before it's too late. I did not have a sharp eye yet, not that year. I had a grieving heart and a quiet house and a granddaughter, Sophie, who was 6 years old and still believed, with her whole small chest, that grandmothers were magic. Sophie was Diane's only child, and she was, without question, the single steadiest joy left in my life after Walter died. She would climb onto my lap on Sunday visits and demand I tell her the story of how her grandfather built our porch swing with wood left over from a stranger's barn, and I would tell it exactly the same way every time, because children do not want new stories. They want the old ones told with love intact. It was Sophie, more than anything else, who kept me rooted in that house those first 2 years. Every wall held a memory Walter and I had built together, and every visit from Sophie added a new one on top of it. I told myself, foolishly perhaps, that as long as I had that house and that girl, grief could not entirely hollow me out. I did not yet know that both of those things, the house and the girl, would eventually become exactly what my daughter and her husband decided to fight over. Richard, my son-in-law, ran a car dealership 2 towns over, one of those mid-sized lots with banners flapping in the wind, advertising financing for anyone breathing. For years, I assumed the business was thriving, because Richard always dressed like a man whose business was thriving, always drove the newest truck on the lot, always insisted on picking up the check at family dinners with a flourish that seemed, in hindsight, almost theatrical. I did not learn until much later, far too late to protect myself properly, that behind those banners and that flourish sat a dealership hemorrhaging money to a floor plan lender who had started making phone calls Richard no longer wanted to answer. At a Sunday dinner 2 years after Walter's death, with Sophie coloring quietly at the end of the table and green beans going cold on 4 plates, Diane said something I would carry with me for the rest of my life, though I did not understand its true weight until much later. "Mom doesn't know what's best for her anymore," she said, not to me, but about me, to Richard across the table, as though I were a piece of furniture being discussed for reupholstering. I remember setting down my fork very slowly. I remember Sophie glancing up, 8 years old by then, confused by the sudden silence at a table she had thought was simply having dinner. "I'm sitting right here, Diane," I said. "I know, Mom," she said, and smiled the smile she used to give teachers who'd caught her cheating on a test back in middle school. "That's exactly what I mean." I did not know that night that I had just heard the first line of a script that had already been written for me. I did not know that somewhere between the phone calls about downsizing and the dinners about what was best, a plan had already begun taking shape, one that required me to become, in the eyes of a judge and a doctor, and eventually a courtroom, someone I was not. I did not know that the road from that dinner table to a spilled bottle of pills and a whispered warning would run through a single ordinary staircase on a single ordinary Thursday less than a year later. I fell down that staircase on a rainy October evening, and I did not fall the way you might imagine a 70-year-old woman falling. I fell the way a woman falls when something has already been quietly slipped into her evening tea for 11 days running, and nobody had yet told her why. That fall changed everything that came after it, and I did not understand, not for many more months, that it had been the whole point all along. 3 years is a long time to slowly lose your footing, in every sense of that phrase. And I have come to believe that the hardest part of being betrayed by your own family is not the betrayal itself. It is the sheer, patient normalcy of it. Nobody hands you a document titled, "Plan to Take Everything." Instead, they hand you a phone call about downsizing, a dinner comment about what's best, a staircase you have climbed 4,000 times without incident, and then, one October evening, without any incident at all. They hand you small things, one at a time, until one morning a paid stranger has to whisper the truth to you beneath your own kitchen table because your own daughter no longer will. I did not fall down those stairs by accident, and it took me the better part of a year to understand exactly why and exactly who had made certain I would. That October night, I remember reaching for the handrail Walter had installed himself. Thick oak, sanded smooth, bolted into studs he had located by knocking on the wall with his knuckle, the way some men listen for a heartbeat. I remember my hand finding it. I remember my foot not finding the step. And then I remember nothing at all until I woke up in a hospital bed with fluorescent light overhead and Diane's face hovering above me. And for one brief, foolish moment, I felt something like relief, because my daughter was there. And surely a daughter who rushed to a hospital bed still loved her mother enough to protect her. I did not yet understand that some people rush to hospital beds not out of love, but out of opportunity. The doctor who examined me that night was not Dr. Alvarez, the physician I had trusted for 11 years. The one who had signed Walter's death certificate with tears actually standing in his own eyes. It was a new name on my chart, a Dr. Sheldon Voss, whom Diane explained, in a rush of concerned daughter speak, had been recommended by a friend and was just so much more thorough with elderly patients. I did not think anything of it at the time. Grief and a fractured wrist and a mild concussion do not leave much room for suspicion. I only wanted to go home, to my own bed, in my own house, on my own street, where Walter's handrail was waiting to be climbed correctly the next time. Diane had other plans, and she presented them to me the way she presented most things by then, wrapped in the soft cotton of concern. "You can't be alone right now, Mom," she said, sitting at the edge of my hospital bed, her hand resting on mine in a gesture that would have looked, to any stranger walking past, like tenderness. "Richard and I talked about it. We think you need someone with you, just for a while, just until you're steadier. I want to be honest with you about something. Some small, tired part of me, the part still concussed and still frightened and still 81 years old in every way that mattered that week, actually felt grateful." I said yes. I signed a form allowing a home health agency to place a caregiver in my house 6 days a week, and I thought, foolishly, that I was accepting help. I did not understand that I was accepting surveillance. Marisol Reyes arrived 9 days after I came home from the hospital, standing on my porch in gray scrubs with a duffel bag of supplies and an expression I could not yet read: careful, watchful, professionally neutral in the exact way trained caregivers learn to be neutral when they walk into a house they do not yet understand. For the first several weeks, I resented her presence, the way you resent anyone who reminds you, simply by existing in your kitchen at 7 in the morning, that you are no longer entirely trusted to exist alone. I was polite to her because my mother raised me to be polite to strangers in my home, but I kept my guard up. I did not know then that Marisol was watching something far more troubling than my balance and my blood pressure. I did not know she was quietly documenting a pattern she recognized from another house, another family, another elderly woman she had once cared for and had not been able to save in time. It was Marisol who first noticed that the new prescriptions Dr. Voss had written after my fall did not entirely match what a woman recovering from a concussion and a fractured wrist should have been taking. There was a sedative among them, a small blue tablet I did not recognize, listed on my chart under a name I could not pronounce. And Marisol told me later that she had asked Dr. Voss's office about it twice and received 2 different, vague answers both times. She kept measuring it into my organizer anyway, because that was her job, and because questioning a doctor's orders as a hired caregiver can cost a person her license. But she started writing dates and times into a small spiral notebook she kept in her scrub pocket, quietly, the way a woman keeps a record of something she suspects she may one day need to prove. I began noticing the fog myself around the same time, though I did not yet have language for it. I would sit down to pay a bill and find myself, 20 minutes later, still staring at the same envelope, unable to recall what number I had meant to write. I would start a sentence at dinner and lose the end of it somewhere between my brain and my mouth, watching Diane's face carefully to see whether she noticed. And always she noticed, and always she looked, for just a flicker of a second, satisfied. I told myself I was imagining that satisfaction. I told myself grief did strange things to a mind, and concussions did stranger things still, and that a daughter watching her mother struggle would never feel anything but sorrow. I know now that I was wrong, and I know now exactly what that flicker on her face actually was. Money began disappearing from my checking account in amounts small enough that I doubted my own eyes each time I noticed them. $40 here, $60 there, a withdrawal I did not recall authorizing, time-stamped on a day I had no memory of leaving the house. When I raised it with Diane, gently, the way you raise a concern with a daughter you still desperately want to trust, she sighed the particular sigh she had begun reserving just for me and said, "Mom, this is exactly what we've been worried about. You're getting confused about your own finances. It happens. It's not your fault." Not my fault. As though confusion were a diagnosis she had already written for me in ink before a single doctor had confirmed it. 3 weeks after that conversation, Diane arrived on a Sunday with a folder of papers and a pen already uncapped, laid neatly on my kitchen table beside a plate of the lemon bars I used to bake for her when she was a girl, as if sugar and butter might make a woman sign away her own name more willingly. "It's just a power of attorney," she said, sliding the folder toward me. "Dad and I actually talked about this years ago before he passed. He wanted me to have it ready, just in case. I want you to understand something about that lie, because it is the exact moment I began, truly began, to understand what was happening to me. Walter Hartwell never once in 46 years of marriage made a single financial decision without discussing it with me first, at our own kitchen table, over coffee, as equals. The idea that he had quietly arranged, behind my back, to hand control of our life's assets to our daughter in the event of my incapacity, without ever once mentioning it to the woman he built that kitchen table for, was not merely false. It was an insult to the memory of a man who had spent his entire life proving, board by board, hinge by hinge, that he trusted me completely. I did not sign the folder that Sunday. I told Diane I needed time to read it properly, and she smiled the smile she had given Richard across that dinner table 2 years earlier, the smile that said she had expected resistance and had already planned for it. "Of course, Mom," she said. "Take all the time you need. We just want what's best for you." There it was again. What's best for me, spoken by the one person in the world who I was slowly, sickeningly beginning to understand had stopped believing anything of the sort. I lay awake that night in the bed Walter and I had shared for 46 years, staring at a water stain on the ceiling shaped, absurdly, like the state of Ohio, and I made myself ask the question I had been avoiding for months. What if none of this was concern at all? What if every phone call about downsizing, every comment about what was best, every new pill in a color I did not recognize, was part of something deliberate, something planned, something aimed not at protecting me but at emptying me out, slowly, quietly, until there was nothing left for anyone to protect? I did not have proof yet. I only had a water stain shaped like a state I had never once visited, and a growing certainty that the daughter I had raised had somewhere along the way decided that my house, my savings, and my late husband's legacy were worth more to her than I was. I did not know yet how right I was, or how close the plan already was to completion. I only knew that 4 months later, on an ordinary Tuesday morning, a paid nurse would kneel beneath my kitchen table, gather 42 spilled pills into her palm, and whisper the 4 words that would finally give my suspicion a name. I did not sleep well after that night with the water stain shaped like Ohio, and in the weeks that followed, small things began arriving in my life the way termites arrive in a house, quietly, one at a time, doing their damage long before anyone notices the floorboards have gone soft. The first thing I noticed was the mail. I had received a bank statement from First Millbrook Trust on the 3rd of every month for as long as I could remember, a plain white envelope with a blue logo in the corner, arriving reliably enough that I used to joke with Walter that our postman could set his watch by it. That February, the 3rd came and went with no envelope at all. I told myself the post office had simply misplaced it, the way mail sometimes goes astray, and I waited for April, and then May, and by the time June's statement failed to arrive as well, I could no longer explain it away as coincidence. I called the bank myself, sitting at my kitchen table with my address book open to a page of numbers I had written in Walter's careful, blocky handwriting years before he died, because I still could not bring myself to throw that book away. A young man named Kevin answered, polite and slightly bored, and when I asked him why my statements had stopped arriving, he informed me, after a pause I did not like the sound of, that a change of mailing address had been submitted on my account 4 months earlier, redirecting my statements to a post office box 2 towns over, in the same zip code as Richard's dealership. I remember sitting very still with the phone pressed to my ear, my heart doing something strange and heavy in my chest, because I had never once submitted such a request, never signed a single form authorizing it, and yet there it was, typed neatly into a bank's official records, as though I had simply decided one day to stop receiving my own financial information in my own home. "Ma'am," Kevin said, his boredom gone now, replaced by the careful tone bank employees use when they sense a problem larger than their training covers. The request came in with your account number and the last 4 digits of your social security number. It would have needed to be submitted either by you directly or by someone with power of attorney on file. I told him, evenly, that no power of attorney existed on that account and had never existed, and I asked him to reverse the change immediately and flag the account for any further unauthorized activity. He did, apologizing twice, and I hung up the phone and sat at my kitchen table for a long while, staring at nothing, doing the arithmetic I did not want to do. 4 months of statements, redirected quietly to a post office box near my son-in-law's dealership. 4 months of me having no idea whether money had moved, whether balances had shifted, whether anything at all had changed in accounts I had once balanced to the penny every single month for 48 years. I thought of the missing $40 here, the missing $60 there, small enough that I had doubted my own eyes each time, and I understood, sitting there with the phone still warm in my hand, that those small amounts had likely never been the whole story. They had only ever been the visible tip of something much larger, hidden beneath 4 months of statements I had never been allowed to see. I did not confront Diane about the bank right away. I want to be honest about why, because I think it matters. I was afraid, not of her anger, but of her explanation, because some frightened part of me still believed that if I asked her directly, she would have an answer smooth enough to make the whole thing sound reasonable again, the way she had made the power of attorney folder sound reasonable, the way she had made the new doctor sound reasonable, the way she had made every single erosion of my independence sound, on its surface, like nothing more than a daughter's love. Instead, I began watching more carefully. I started noticing things I had let pass unremarked for months. A locksmith's van parked in my driveway one Tuesday afternoon while I was at a hair appointment Diane herself had arranged and driven me to, though I had not requested any locksmith, and found, upon returning home, that my back door key no longer fit smoothly in its lock, requiring an extra half-turn I had never needed before. A stack of mail on my counter that looked, some mornings, as though it had already been opened and resealed, the flap not quite meeting the envelope the way glue naturally holds it. A conversation I overheard through the kitchen window one warm afternoon in April, Richard's voice carrying across the driveway to where he stood beside his truck, saying to someone on the phone, "No, it's under control. We're handling the mother situation. Just give us until summer." The mother situation. As though I were a weather pattern to be managed rather than a woman standing 30 feet away with the window cracked open for fresh air. I did not sleep the night I overheard that phrase. I lay in the dark and thought about every conversation I had ever had with Diane since Walter's funeral, replaying them the way you replay a piece of music you suddenly realize was written in a different key than you first believed. Every note reinterpreted, every phrase suddenly meaning something colder than it had seemed at the time. It was around this same period that I began, very quietly, keeping a small calendar in the kitchen drawer beside my recipe cards, marking down, in shorthand only I could read, the days Diane visited alone, the days she brought food or tea I had not requested, the days I felt unusually foggy or unusually sharp, trying, without yet fully understanding why, to build some private record of my own life that existed outside whatever version my daughter might one day choose to tell a doctor, or a lawyer, or a judge. I did not yet know how badly I would need that calendar. I only knew that some old, stubborn instinct, the same instinct that had once told me not to trust a contractor's cheap estimate or a salesman's easy smile, was telling me now to keep my own quiet accounting of my own life, because I could no longer be entirely certain anyone else was keeping an honest one for me. Marisol arrived in my life during exactly this stretch of quiet, private suspicion, 4 months after the fall, and for the first several weeks, I did not trust her any more than I trusted anyone else moving through my house with a key and an agenda I could not fully see. I watched her the way I had learned to watch everyone by then, carefully, from the corner of my eye, cataloging small details. I noticed that she wrote things down in a spiral notebook she kept tucked in her scrub pocket, always when she thought I was not looking. I noticed that she double-checked the labels on my prescription bottles against a printed sheet she kept folded in her tote bag, comparing them slowly, her lips moving slightly as she read, the way a person reads something they do not entirely trust to be accurate. I noticed that her jaw would tighten, almost imperceptibly, on the mornings Diane stayed in the kitchen a little too long after Marisol's shift began, hovering near the counter where the pill organizer sat, in a way that had nothing to do with a daughter simply saying good morning to her mother's caregiver. I did not understand for a long time that Marisol Reyes was conducting her own quiet investigation alongside mine, running parallel to my calendar in the recipe drawer. Two women in the same house, building two separate cases, neither of them yet trusted the other enough to share. The Tuesday everything finally cracked open began like any other. I woke at 6, the way I had woken every morning of my adult life, made myself a cup of coffee. I was no longer supposed to drink black, according to Dr. Voss's notes, though I drank it black anyway, because I was still, whatever anyone else believed, capable of deciding for myself what went into my own body. I sat at my kitchen table in the pale, early light coming through the window over the sink, the same window through which I had overheard Richard's phone call about handling the mother situation, and I waited for Marisol's gray sedan to appear in the driveway at 7, the rosary swinging gently from her rearview mirror the way it always did. She arrived on time, as she always did. But something in the way she climbed out of that car was different that morning, and I noticed it the way you notice a single cloud arriving ahead of a storm still miles away. Her movements were quicker than usual, almost clipped. She did not greet me with her ordinary soft, "Good morning, Mrs. Hartwell." She simply nodded, hung her jacket on the hook by the door, and went straight to the counter where the pill organizer waited, her back to me, her shoulders set in a way I had never once seen in 4 months of watching her. I asked her, gently, whether everything was all right, and she told me, too quickly, that everything was fine, that she had simply slept poorly. I did not believe her, but I did not press, because by then I had learned that people volunteer their truths on their own timeline, not on the timeline you would prefer. And pressing too hard too soon can close a door that patience might otherwise have opened on its own. She measured my morning pills into the organizer with hands that trembled slightly, a tremor so small I might have missed it entirely if I had not spent 4 months learning, out of pure necessity, to notice every small thing that moved through my kitchen. And then, reaching for the lid to close the compartment, her hand slipped, and the whole organizer tipped and scattered across the table. 42 pills in 6 different colors, rolling across the wood Walter had sanded smooth 30 years before. Some falling to the floor, some coming to rest against my own folded hands. I remember thinking, in that strange, suspended half-second before she moved, that I had never once seen Marisol Reyes drop anything in 4 months of steady, careful work. And some part of me understood, even before she knelt down, even before her hand found mine beneath that table, that this was not clumsiness at all. It was the moment she had finally decided to stop watching silently, the way I had been watching silently, and start speaking the truth instead. They want you gone. And once a woman hears those words spoken aloud, in her own kitchen, by someone with nothing obvious to gain from lying to her, she cannot ever again pretend she did not hear them. I did not sleep at all the night after Marisol whispered those words to me. I lay in the dark, listening to the house settle the way old houses do. The way Walter used to say, a house talks to the people who love it. And I turned her sentence over and over until it had worn smooth in my mind, the way a stone wears smooth in a riverbed. They want you gone. Not they're worried about you. Not they think you need help. Gone. A word with an ending built into it. A word that did not leave room for gentle interpretation. The next morning, when Marisol arrived at 7 with her rosary swinging from the rearview mirror of her gray sedan, I did something I had not done in the 4 months she had worked in my home. I asked her to sit down with me at the kitchen table, the same table where the pills had scattered, and I asked her, plainly, what she meant. She looked at the door first, not dramatically, not the way it happens in the movies, but quickly, instinctively, the look of a woman checking whether a room is truly empty before she speaks a truth that could cost her a job, or worse. Then she folded her hands on the table in front of her, the same careful hands that measured my pills every morning, and she told me a story I had not asked for and did not expect, about her own grandmother, back in a small town outside Reynosa, a woman named Consuelo who had raised 6 children on almost nothing and had, in her final years, been quietly, systematically drugged and isolated by a nephew who wanted her modest house for himself. By the time my mother figured out what was happening, Marisol told me, her voice low and even, Consuelo could barely remember her own children's names. The judge signed the guardianship papers in 11 minutes. 11 minutes, Mrs. Hartwell, to hand a woman's whole life to a man who had never once changed her bandages or paid her a bill. She looked up at me then, and her eyes were wet, though her voice never wavered. I took this job because the money was good. I stayed because 3 weeks in, I recognized what I was watching. I have seen this exact pattern before, in this exact order, and I promised myself I would never again stay silent while it happened to someone else. I asked her what pattern, precisely, she believed she was watching in my house. She told me everything, calmly, methodically, the way a woman recites facts she has rehearsed alone in her car at night because she needed, desperately, to say them out loud to someone before they consumed her. She told me that the sedative Dr. Voss had added to my prescriptions after the fall was not a standard post-concussion medication, and that she had researched it herself, and that its most common side effects were exactly the fog and the memory lapses and the mid-sentence confusion I had been experiencing for months. She told me that on 4 separate occasions, she had found extra pills in my organizer that did not match anything on my official chart. Small, unmarked tablets that Diane herself had added during visits when Marisol stepped out of the room. Tablets Marisol had quietly photographed on her phone before disposing of them, unable to prove where they'd come from, but certain enough of the pattern to be frightened. She told me that Dr. Voss's office was not, as Diane had claimed, a recommendation from a friend, but a practice Richard's dealership had done business with for years, handling workers' comp claims for his employees, a practice Marisol had confirmed with one careful phone call under the pretense of transferring records. She told me that Richard's dealership was, according to a cousin of hers who worked at a bank 2 counties over, and who Marisol swore to secrecy before ever repeating a word of it to me, more than $140,000 behind on a floor plan loan, with a lender who had already sent 2 formal notices threatening to seize the entire inventory. And she told me, last, the piece of information that made my hands go cold on that kitchen table. She told me that Diane had scheduled, for the 2nd week of June, a formal capacity evaluation with Dr. Voss, the first legal step toward petitioning the county probate court for guardianship and conservatorship over my person and my estate. If that petition succeeded, Diane would gain full legal authority over my finances, my medical decisions, and my place of residence, with no further consent required from me at all. My house on Maple Ridge Lane, Walter's investment accounts, the lake cabin at Miller's Lake we had bought the year Sophie was born. All of it transferred into my daughter's control on the signature of a doctor who had never once treated me before my fall, based on symptoms his own prescriptions had almost certainly caused. "Why are you telling me this?" I asked her, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "You could lose everything for saying this out loud." "Because somebody told my grandmother's truth 11 minutes too late," Marisol said. "I am not going to let that happen again in this kitchen." I sat with that for a long moment, the water stain shaped like Ohio flashing unbidden into my mind, the memory of Walter's handrail, the memory of Diane's face across a dinner table 2 years earlier, satisfied, watching me lose the end of my own sentences. I thought of Sophie, 9 years old now, still climbing onto my lap on Sundays, still asking for the story of the porch swing, still believing with her whole small chest that her grandmother was magic. I thought about what it would mean for that girl to grow up believing that betraying an old woman for her house and her savings was simply what a family did when it was convenient, and something inside me, something that had been quietly folding itself smaller and smaller for 2 years, finally refused to fold any further. "Then help me prove it," I said. "Properly, legally, before June." Marisol looked at me for a long moment, and something shifted behind her careful eyes, something that looked almost like relief, the particular relief of a person who has been carrying a secret alone for months and has finally been allowed to set half of it down. "Yes, ma'am," she said. "I already started." It turned out she had. Tucked inside the lining of her tote bag, beneath a spare change of scrubs, Marisol kept a slim folder of her own, photographs of unmarked pills time-stamped on her phone, a handwritten log of dates and dosages that did not match my official chart, a printed record of a phone call she'd placed to Dr. Voss's billing office under a false pretense, and a single voicemail she had saved from 3 weeks earlier, an accidental recording Richard had left on my house phone meant for Diane, in which his voice, tight with a fear I had never once heard from him before, said the words that would eventually end this entire scheme. I want to tell you exactly what he said, because it became the single most important 11 seconds of audio in my entire life. But I will save that for later, because in that moment, sitting across from Marisol Reyes at my kitchen table, I did not yet know how it would be used. I only knew, for the first time in months, that I was no longer alone in this house. I want to be honest about something else, too. Something the polite version of this story would leave out. Discovering the truth did not feel like triumph. It felt like grief, layered on top of grief. The particular grief of realizing that the daughter you nursed through chickenpox and taught to ride a bicycle and walk down an aisle had, at some point in the last 3 years, begun calculating my worth in square footage and account balances rather than in Sunday phone calls. I cried that afternoon after Marisol left, alone at my kitchen table, not because I was afraid of losing my house, though I was, but because I finally understood that I had already lost something far more precious long before any pill had ever been slipped into my tea. I sat at that table long after Marisol's gray sedan had pulled out of the driveway, the light outside shifting from the flat white of afternoon into the long gold slant of early evening. And I did not move to turn on a single lamp. I let the kitchen go dim around me, because some part of me needed the darkness to match what I was feeling. And because Walter had always said a house should be allowed to breathe in its own shadows sometimes, that not every room needed to be lit just because a person was sitting in it. I thought about calling Diane. I want you to understand that because I think it matters, that even after everything Marisol had just told me, even after hearing the words, "they want you gone," spoken aloud in my own kitchen, some old, stubborn, motherly part of me still reached instinctively for the phone, still wanted to hear my daughter's voice and ask her, plainly, whether any of it could possibly be true. I picked up the receiver twice that evening. I set it back down twice. I understood, somewhere beneath the grief, that if I called her that night, unprepared, with nothing but a whispered warning and a mother's wounded heart, she would have an explanation ready before I even finished my first sentence, smooth and reasonable, the way she always did. And I would walk away from that call more confused than I had been before I picked up the phone. Instead, I did something I had not done in nearly 3 years. I went upstairs to the small linen closet at the end of the hallway, the one Walter had built with an extra shelf specifically for storing things we could not bear to throw away and could not bear to look at every day either. And I pulled down the cardboard box marked in his own blocky handwriting simply, Walter, Misk. I carried that box down the hallway with both arms, the cardboard soft and slightly bowed at the corners from 3 years of sitting undisturbed on that high shelf. And I set it down on the hallway floor rather than carrying it to the kitchen table, because some part of me understood, without quite deciding it consciously, that whatever waited inside deserved to be opened somewhere quieter than the room where I had just learned my daughter wanted me gone. I sat down on the floor beside it, my back against the wall Walter had framed himself the same autumn Diane turned 12. And for a long moment, I simply rested my hand flat against the closed cardboard lid, not lifting it, the way you sometimes rest your hand against a door before you open it, giving yourself one last quiet second to prepare for whatever waits on the other side. I remembered Walter building this very closet, actually, now that I sat beneath it. He had insisted on the extra shelf himself, over my mild objection that we did not need that much storage in a hallway barely wide enough for 2 people to pass. And he had told me, in the particular patient voice he used whenever he was quietly right about something practical, that every house needs one place built specifically for the things a person cannot bear to look at every day, and cannot bear to throw away either. I had laughed at him for that, gently, the way you laugh at a husband whose wisdom sometimes arrives wrapped in carpentry metaphors. I did not laugh anymore. Sitting there on that hallway floor 3 years after burying him, I understood that Walter had built me a place to grieve properly, decades before either of us knew grief was coming. The same way he built the handrail on the stairs decades before I would ever need to catch myself on it. I thought, too, sitting there, about how strange it is that a marriage of 46 years compresses, in memory, not into one long, unbroken story, but into a handful of specific, sharply lit moments that seem to stand in for everything else. I did not think, in that quiet hallway, about the thousands of ordinary Tuesday dinners Walter and I shared, the ordinary arguments about money or in-laws or which route to take to the lake cabin. I thought instead about the morning he proposed to me on the tailgate of his work truck, still in his boots, too nervous to wait until he'd changed his shirt. I thought about the night Diane was born, Walter pacing a hospital hallway not unlike this one, and the first time he held her, his enormous, calloused hands suddenly, impossibly gentle. I thought about the year he built this house, board by board, and how he used to come inside each evening covered in sawdust and kiss me on the forehead before he'd even washed his hands, because he said he could not stand to wait one more minute to touch me. Grief, I have come to understand, does not erase a marriage. It distills it, boiling away everything ordinary until only the purest, most concentrated moments remain. And those moments become, in a strange way, heavier to carry than the whole 46 years ever were while you were simply living inside them. I thought, sitting there, about whether Walter would have seen this coming, whether some part of him, watching Richard grow more anxious and more evasive at family dinners in his final year, had already sensed the shape of what was slowly forming beneath our own daughter's careful smile. I did not yet know, that evening, exactly how right that instinct of mine would turn out to be. I only knew that Walter had never once, in 46 years, built anything without first testing whether the ground beneath it could actually bear the weight. And I found myself hoping, foolishly perhaps, that somewhere in that box marked Walter, M-I-S-T, some small trace of that same careful foresight might still be waiting for me, 3 years too late to spare me the pain of these past months, but perhaps not too late to help me now. I lifted the lid at last, slowly, the cardboard flaps stiff with age, releasing a faint smell of dust and old paper, and, underneath it, something fainter still. The particular scent of a man's aftershave that lingers in fabric and cardboard alike long after the man himself is gone. A smell that stopped me cold for a moment, my hand hovering above the open box, my throat suddenly too tight to swallow. I had gone through that box exactly once before, 6 months after his funeral, and had closed it again after only 20 minutes, because grief that fresh does not yet know how to hold old photographs without breaking apart entirely. This time, 3 years distant from that first unbearable grief, I opened it slowly, and I let myself actually look. There were photographs, of course. Walter in his work boots standing in front of a half-framed house sometime in the 70s. Walter and me at a lake somewhere I could no longer place, young and sunburned and laughing at something the camera had not captured. There were old receipts for lumber, a stack of business cards from suppliers long out of business, a single dried flower pressed flat between 2 pieces of wax paper that I did not remember pressing and could not explain even now. And near the bottom, tucked inside an envelope that had once held a birthday card, I found a single business card, cream-colored, slightly yellowed at the edges, printed with the name Warren T. Kessler, attorney at law. And beneath it, an office address I recognized as the same modest brick building Warren had practiced out of for as long as I had known him. On the back of that card, in Walter's handwriting, 7 words. Just in case, talk to Warren first. Nothing else. No date, no explanation. I sat on the floor of that hallway for a long time, the box open beside me, that small cream-colored card resting in my palm, and I did not understand what it meant. I assumed, in that moment, that it referred to something ordinary, some old conversation about our wills or our funeral arrangements, the kind of practical note a careful man leaves behind for a wife he expects to outlive him by years. I slipped the card into the pocket of my cardigan instead of putting it back in the box, not because I understood its significance yet, but because something in me, some quiet instinct I had learned to trust more and more in recent months, told me not to let it out of my sight. I would not understand the true weight of those 7 words for several more weeks, not until Warren himself explained, over the phone, exactly what conversation Walter had been referring to when he wrote them. But I want you to remember that card, tucked in my cardigan pocket that evening, because it would turn out to be one of the most important objects in this entire story. Small and easy to overlook, exactly the way the truest kind of protection so often is. The phone rang while I was still sitting on that hallway floor, and I nearly did not answer it, certain it would be Diane, calling to check in the way she always did in the evenings, her voice bright and careful, and entirely unaware that her own nurse had just spent the afternoon telling her mother the truth. But when I finally reached for the cordless phone charging in its cradle at the end of the hall, the screen showed a different name entirely. Sophie. "Grandma," she said the moment I answered, her 9-year-old voice bursting through the receiver with the particular unfiltered joy children have not yet learned to soften. "I got a gold star on my piano piece today, Mrs. Kowalski. Said I was ready for the recital music now. Can I play it for you on Sunday? I've been practicing every single day." I sat down properly on the small bench Walter had built into that hallway alcove specifically for phone calls, decades before cordless phones made such a bench unnecessary. And I let Sophie's voice pour over me like something warm poured over something cold. And for 4 or 5 minutes, I simply listened to my granddaughter describe, in exhaustive, joyful detail, every measure of a piece by a composer she could not quite pronounce. And I felt, for the first time all day, something other than grief. "Grandma," she said eventually, her voice shifting, the way children's voices shift when they sense something in an adult they cannot name but can feel. "Are you okay? You sound different." Children notice more than we give them credit for, and I have come to believe that Sophie, even at 9 years old, had already begun sensing the strange currents moving beneath her own family's surface, the tension between her mother and her grandmother that no one had explained to her directly, but that she felt anyway. The way you feel a storm coming before a single cloud appears on the horizon. "I'm just a little tired, sweetheart," I told her, and it was not entirely a lie. "But I am so proud of you. I will be there Sunday, in the very front row, and I will clap so loudly you will be embarrassed." She laughed, the bright, uncomplicated laugh of a child who still believed, with her whole small chest, that the adults in her life would always be exactly where they promised to be. And that promise settled something in me that Marisol's warning had shaken loose. I thought of Marisol's words again, the ones about her own grandmother, Consuelo, whom a nephew had drugged and isolated until she no longer remembered her own children's names. And I thought about Sophie, 9 years old, still believing her grandmother was magic. And I made myself a private promise, sitting on that phone bench with the cordless receiver warm against my ear. I was not going to become a cautionary tale told in whispers at some other frightened family's kitchen table years from now. I was not going to let Sophie grow up believing that her own mother had once tried to erase her grandmother quietly, legally, with a doctor's signature and an unmarked pill, and that the world had simply allowed it to happen. After I hung up with Sophie, I went back downstairs to the kitchen, turned on the light over the stove, the small one Walter always left burning at night so neither of us would stumble in the dark, and I took out the spiral notebook I had recently begun hiding beneath the false bottom of my sewing basket, the one where I had started writing down dates and conversations and small suspicious details. And for the first time, I wrote something in it that was not a fact, but a decision. I wrote, in my own careful hand, the same hand that had once balanced a checkbook to the penny for 48 consecutive years, 3 words: I will fight. I do not know if you have ever written a sentence like that to yourself, alone, in a quiet kitchen, with nobody watching and nothing yet proven. But I can tell you that the act of writing it changed something in my chest. Some muscle I had not used in a very long time, tightening back into shape the way a muscle does after disuse. Painful at first, and then, slowly, stronger. I thought about calling Warren that very night, the cream-colored card still sitting in my cardigan pocket, but it was already past 8, and I did not yet fully understand what Walter's 7 words on the back of that card actually meant. And some part of me wanted to hold that mystery a little longer, The way you hold an unopened letter for one more day, savoring the last moment before you know for certain what it says. Instead, I did something smaller, something quieter, but something that felt, at the time, like the first true act of resistance I had taken in over a year. I went to the hallway closet again, not for Walter's box this time, but for an old fireproof lockbox we had kept for decades in the back corner, behind the winter coats, containing our marriage certificate, the deed to the house, and copies of documents I had not looked at closely since the lawyer's office the week after Walter's funeral. I carried it to the kitchen table, set it down where the pill organizer had spilled its 42 tablets only that morning, and I opened it with the small brass key I still kept on my own keyring, exactly where it had always been, exactly where nobody had ever thought to look, because nobody had ever imagined I would need to look there myself. I did not find anything that night that changed the shape of what was coming. I found only what I expected to find: ordinary papers, ordinary proof of an ordinary life carefully built by two ordinary people who had trusted each other completely for 46 years. But sitting there at that table, going through those papers one by one in the dim kitchen light, I felt something shift inside me that I had not felt since the day of Walter's funeral. I felt like a woman taking inventory of her own life again, rather than a woman waiting quietly for someone else to decide what remained of it. I did not yet know that a trust existed, hidden safely away in Warren Kessler's office, drafted quietly 6 months before Walter's death, precisely because he had sensed some early warning sign in Richard's business that he had never fully explained to me. I did not yet know that the 7 words on the back of that cream-colored card were about to become the single most important clue in the entire fight ahead of me. I only knew, closing that lockbox and carrying it back to its place behind the winter coats, that grief, however heavy, had stopped being the only thing left in my chest. But grief, I have learned, can coexist with resolve, if you let it. And by the time the sun went down that Tuesday, I had made a decision that would define everything that followed. I was not going to wait quietly in my own kitchen for June to arrive, hoping Dr. Voss's 11-minute evaluation would somehow find me sharper than my own daughter needed me to appear. I was going to build something of my own. Quietly. Carefully. The way Walter built a foundation, checking every measurement twice before he ever poured the concrete. I did not yet have a lawyer. I did not yet have proof strong enough for a courtroom. I had a nurse willing to risk her job, a voicemail I did not fully understand the weight of, and a mother's fury finally burning clean through months of fog. It would turn out to be exactly enough. But first, it very nearly was not, because Diane, I would soon discover, had already begun moving faster than any of us realized. The first thing I did, the following morning, was stop drinking the evening tea Diane had started bringing over twice a week, under the guise of quality time ever since my fall. I did not accuse her. I did not confront her. I simply told her, pleasantly, that my stomach had been unsettled lately, and I thought I would switch to plain water in the evenings for a while. I watched her face carefully when I said it, the way she had watched mine for 2 years. And I saw something flicker there, too, quick and unreadable, gone before I could name it. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it was everything. I had learned by then not to trust my own certainty about either. The second thing I did was call Warren Kessler. Warren had been Walter's closest friend since they were both 19 years old, working the same construction crew the summer before Walter went into contracting on his own, and Warren went to law school on a scholarship neither of his parents believed he deserved. He had been the best man at our wedding. He had carried Walter's casket, along with 3 other men, on a bitter January morning 3 years earlier, his hands trembling, not from age, but from grief. He was 74 now, technically retired from his elder law practice, though anyone who knew Warren Kessler knew that a man like that never truly stops practicing law, any more than Walter had ever truly stopped noticing a poorly hung door. I had not called Warren much since Walter's death. Grief has a way of making you avoid the people who remind you most sharply of what you've lost. And Warren, with his booming laugh and his habit of quoting Walter's old sayings back to me, reminded me of my husband more sharply than almost anyone alive. But that Wednesday morning, I sat at my kitchen table with the phone in my trembling hand, and I called him anyway, because I no longer had the luxury of avoiding anyone who might be able to help me. "Eleanor," he said when he picked up, and just the sound of my name in his voice, the particular warmth of a man who had loved my husband like a brother, nearly undid me right there on the phone. "It's been too long. How are you holding up out there on Maple Ridge?" I did not know how to answer that question honestly in a single sentence, so I told him everything instead. I told him about the fall, and Dr. Voss, and the sedative Marisol had identified, and the missing money, and the power of attorney folder still sitting unsigned in my kitchen drawer, and the capacity evaluation scheduled for the 2nd week of June, and the phrase that had started it all. Diane's voice across a dinner table saying, "Mom doesn't know what's best for her anymore." I told him about Marisol kneeling under my kitchen table with her hand shaking, and the 4 words she had whispered. And I heard Warren go very quiet on the other end of the line. Quiet in the specific way of a man doing arithmetic he does not like the answer to. "Eleanor," he said finally, "I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to trust that everything I am about to tell you, I am telling you because your husband asked me to, a long time before any of this started." My heart nearly stopped in my chest. "What do you mean?" "Walter came to see me," Warren said, "about 6 months before he died. He never told you, and I imagine that's been eating at him from wherever he is now, watching all this unfold. He was worried, Eleanor, not about you, about Richard's business. He'd heard some things from an old poker buddy who did the books over at that dealership, numbers that didn't sit right with him. He didn't want to upset you, not before he'd confirmed anything, so he came to me instead, and we set something up. Quietly, just in case." Warren explained that 6 months before his death, Walter had established a revocable trust, transferring the deed to our house, the lake cabin, and the bulk of our investment accounts into it, with the 2 of us as primary trustees, exactly as any married couple might do for ordinary estate planning purposes. But Walter had insisted on one additional clause, a clause Warren had drafted personally and filed away in his own office safe, a clause that named Warren himself, not Diane, as successor trustee in the event that either of us ever became incapacitated. Diane did not know the trust existed in its final form. She believed, based on an outdated conversation with Walter years earlier, that she stood to inherit direct control the moment I was declared unable to manage my own affairs. She had built an entire guardianship strategy on information that was no longer true, and had never once bothered to confirm it, because confirming it would have required admitting, even to herself, that she needed to check. "Your husband built you a foundation before he died, Eleanor," Warren said, his voice thick. "He just never got to tell you about it." I sat with the phone pressed to my ear and cried for the 2nd time that week. But this time, it was not only grief. It was something closer to being found. The particular relief of discovering that even after death, even from the other side of loss, Walter Hartwell had still been standing between me and the worst thing the world could try to do to me. Warren told me, gently but firmly, exactly what needed to happen next. The trust document alone would not be enough to stop a guardianship petition if Diane's evaluation succeeded in painting me as incapacitated in the eyes of the court. A judge presented with a medical finding of incapacity could still, in some circumstances, override or complicate a trust's provisions, particularly if Diane's legal team argued the trust itself was outdated or improperly executed. What we needed, Warren said, was to demonstrate, unmistakably, in front of a judge, on the day of any hearing, that I was fully, verifiably competent, and that the medical findings suggesting otherwise had been manufactured through improper medication rather than genuine decline. We needed Marisol's documentation. We needed the voicemail. We needed, ideally, a second independent medical evaluation from a physician with no financial ties to Richard's dealership, conducted after I had been safely off the unnecessary sedative for long enough to demonstrate a clear and measurable improvement. "Can you get off that pill safely?" Warren asked, "without your daughter noticing?" I told him I already had, 3 days earlier, the moment I switched from Diane's tea to plain water in the evenings, though I had not yet told Marisol why, and had not yet realized how much the sedative alone, separate from any other pill, might have been clouding me. Within a week of stopping that tea, I noticed the fog lifting in a way that frightened me almost as much as the fog itself had. I remembered conversations I had thought I'd forgotten. I finished sentences at dinner without losing their endings somewhere in the space between thought and speech. I balanced my checkbook one Thursday evening in 11 minutes flat, the exact amount of time Marisol's grandmother's guardianship hearing had taken to end a woman's freedom. And I sat afterward at my kitchen table and laughed. A short, sharp, disbelieving laugh, because the cruelty of that coincidence felt, in the moment, almost too perfectly designed by fate to ignore. Marisol and I began meeting every morning before Diane's usual check-in calls, at my kitchen table, building our folder alongside Warren's careful legal guidance. Marisol photographed each remaining unmarked pill she found in my organizer, dated and time-stamped, before disposing of it exactly as her supervisor's protocol required, always careful never to break any rule that might cost her the license she needed to keep helping women like me, and like her grandmother, Consuelo. She wrote out, in careful longhand, a full timeline of every symptom she had witnessed, and every date those symptoms had appeared, cross-referenced against the days Diane had visited alone. I began keeping my own notebook, too, a plain spiral notebook I bought at the pharmacy and hid beneath a false bottom in my sewing basket, a place Diane had never once shown any interest in during her visits. In it, I wrote down every phone call, every comment about downsizing, every mention of what was best for me, every date Diane arrived with tea I had not asked for. I wrote down conversations word for word while they were still fresh in my memory, the way Walter used to write down measurements before he cut a single board, because a foundation built on guesswork, he always said, was a foundation waiting to collapse. It was during one of those quiet mornings, going through old phone records with Warren on speakerphone, that we finally understood the true urgency of our timeline. Warren had requested, through a contact still working at the courthouse, a copy of the filing Diane's own attorney had submitted 3 weeks earlier, and what he found made his voice go tight in a way I had never heard from him before. Diane was not merely planning to petition for guardianship in June. She had already filed an emergency motion requesting a temporary conservatorship, citing my recent fall, my documented confusion, and Dr. Voss's preliminary notes, a motion that, if granted, could place my finances under Diane's temporary control within days, weeks before any formal hearing would ever take place. "She's not waiting for June," Warren said. "She's trying to end this before June even matters." I remember sitting very still at my kitchen table when he said that. The same table where Marisol had first knelt and whispered her warning. The same table where I had balanced checkbooks for 48 years. The same table Walter had sanded smooth with his own patient hands. I remember thinking that my daughter had learned, somewhere along the way, to move with a speed and a coldness I did not recognize in the girl who used to climb into my lap and ask me to braid her hair before school. I sat with that thought for a long moment after Warren said it, the coldness of it settling into my chest like a stone dropped into still water, rings spreading outward long after the stone itself had disappeared beneath the surface. I asked him, my voice quieter than I intended, exactly what the emergency motion said, word for word, because I had learned by then that vague fear serves no one, and precise fear, at least, can be answered with precise action. Warren read it to me slowly, over the phone, and I wrote each detail down in my spiral notebook as he spoke, my pen moving the way it used to move balancing a checkbook, steady, deliberate, unwilling to let a single figure pass unrecorded. The motion cited my fall in October. It cited 4 withdrawals from my checking account, totaling $47,000, that Diane's attorney characterized as evidence of financial confusion, though I now understood, with a clarity that made my hands shake around the pen, that those withdrawals corresponded almost exactly to the months my bank statements had been quietly redirected to a post office box near Richard's dealership. It cited Dr. Voss's preliminary notes describing progressive cognitive decline, and it requested, in language so clinical it took me a moment to fully absorb what it meant, that the court freeze my accounts immediately and appoint Diane as temporary conservator, effective within 10 days of a judge's signature, with full authority to manage my finances, my medical care, and my place of residence until a formal guardianship hearing could be scheduled. 10 days. My daughter had asked a judge for the legal authority to move me out of the house Walter built with his own hands, within 10 days, based on $47,000 she herself had likely arranged to disappear. "Eleanor," Warren said, and something in his voice pulled me back from the particular kind of numb, disbelieving fury that had begun creeping up the back of my neck. "I need you to hear me. This is not something a judge grants lightly. Temporary conservatorships without a hearing are meant for genuine emergencies, someone actively endangering themselves, someone with no capacity at all to object. The fact that they are trying to move this fast tells me they know their case is weaker than it looks on paper, and they are hoping speed will do what evidence cannot." I told him then about the cream-colored business card, still tucked in the pocket of the cardigan I had worn nearly every day since I found it. The 7 words in Walter's own handwriting. Just in case. "Talk to Warren first," I asked him, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be, whether he knew what Walter had meant. Warren went quiet on the other end of the line, and when he spoke again, his voice had thickened in a way I recognized from Walter's funeral, from the moment he and 3 other men had carried my husband's casket across frozen ground. "He wrote that the same afternoon we set up the trust, Eleanor," he said. "I remember because he sat in my office afterward for almost an hour, just talking, the way men do when they're trying to put off going home to say something difficult. He told me he was going to give you that card, tell you to keep it somewhere safe, and never explain why unless you actually needed it one day. He didn't want to frighten you over a suspicion he couldn't prove yet. He just wanted you to have a thread to pull, if the day ever came when you needed one." I sat there in my kitchen, holding that small, cream-colored card between 2 fingers, And I understood, fully, for the first time, that my husband had spent the last 6 months of his life quietly building a safety net beneath a marriage he trusted completely, not because he doubted me, but because he had begun, in some small and private way, to doubt our daughter's husband, and had chosen to protect me rather than alarm me. Grief and gratitude arrived in the same breath, the way they so often do, and I let myself cry for exactly as long as it took to fill one tissue, and then I set the card down, squared my shoulders the way Walter used to before he climbed a ladder he did not entirely trust, and went back to work. "We don't have until June, do we?" I said to Warren, and it was not really a question. "No," he said, "we don't." I called Marisol that same afternoon, though it was not one of her scheduled visiting days, and I told her everything Warren had shared. The $47,000, the 10-day window, the frightening speed with which my daughter's attorney was now moving. She listened without interrupting, the way she always did, and when I finished, she said something that surprised me. "Mrs. Hartwell, I think we need to stop reacting to what they're doing and start deciding ourselves what happens next. I've been documenting for weeks. It's time to use it." Over the following 2 days, Marisol and I worked with an urgency I had not felt since the early years of raising Diane herself, back when every decision, every doctor's appointment, every school form had carried the particular electric pressure of a mother determined not to let her child fall through any cracks the world might offer. We organized her photographed pill logs by date. We cross-referenced them against my own notebook, matching her clinical observations against my personal account of every foggy afternoon, every lost sentence, every withdrawal I had never authorized. We printed, at the small copy shop 2 towns over, 3 complete sets of every document, one for Warren, one for me, and one Marisol kept hidden in a lockbox at her own apartment, because by then, none of us fully trusted that anything left in my house alone was entirely safe from being quietly removed. I also began, at Warren's gentle but insistent suggestion, a kind of rehearsal I found almost unbearably humiliating at first, though I came to understand its necessity. He explained that if the guardian ad litem visited, or if Dr. Voss's evaluation somehow proceeded regardless, I needed to be prepared to demonstrate, clearly and without hesitation, exactly the kind of competence Diane's entire case depended on erasing. Not performing intelligence, he was careful to clarify, but simply removing every obstacle that fog or nerves might place between my actual mind and the words that needed to come out of it. Marisol and I practiced together, at my kitchen table. The same table that had held 42 spilled pills and a whispered warning only weeks earlier. She would ask me questions the way she imagined an evaluator might. What day of the week it was, who the sitting president was, what I had eaten for breakfast. And I would answer, at first haltingly, embarrassed by how strange it felt to prove myself to my own hired nurse. And then, as the days passed and the sedative continued clearing fully from my system, with a growing, almost defiant confidence. She asked me to walk her through my finances from memory, and I did, reciting the balance of my checking account, my modest certificate of deposit at First Millbrook Trust, the property taxes on the house, due each October and April, the maintenance costs on the lake cabin at Miller's Lake. All of it exact, all of it correct. Numbers I had carried in my head for decades, the way some women carry recipes or hymns. "You are sharper than most people I have cared for in 15 years of this work," Marisol told me one afternoon, closing her notebook after another round of questions. I want you to remember that. Whatever anyone says to you in that courtroom, this was never about your mind failing, Mrs. Hartwell. It was about someone deciding your mind was inconvenient. I held on to that sentence the way I had held on to the cream-colored card, folding it carefully into the part of myself that still, despite everything, occasionally doubted my own footing. It was one thing to know, privately, in my own kitchen, that I was not confused. It was another thing entirely to imagine standing in a courtroom under fluorescent light with my own daughter seated across the aisle, and trusting that knowledge to hold steady under pressure I had never once in my life been asked to withstand. Warren called again 2 evenings later, this time with news that tightened the timeline even further than we had feared. The emergency motion had been assigned a hearing date by the court clerk's office, not the full guardianship hearing we had been preparing for, aimed at June, but a preliminary hearing on the temporary conservatorship itself, scheduled far sooner than any of us had anticipated. A hearing that could grant Diane immediate, if temporary, control over my finances and my medical decisions long before the more thorough proceeding Warren had originally planned to fight in June. We did not have until June. We did not have until June. We had, according to the court filing Warren had obtained, exactly 17 days. 17 days to gather enough proof to stop a woman I had raised from legally erasing me, and 17 days to decide, once and for all, whether the daughter I remembered was still in there somewhere, or whether she had already, quietly, become someone else entirely. I did not know the answer to that question yet. I only knew that Sophie had a piano recital in 9 of those 17 days, and that I intended, no matter what else happened, to be sitting in that audience as a free woman, not a defendant in a courtroom deciding my own fate. 17 days is not very much time to save a life, but it is, I discovered, exactly enough time if you refuse to waste a single one of them. Warren moved faster than I had ever seen a semi-retired lawyer move in my life. Within 48 hours of learning about the emergency motion, he had filed a formal objection on my behalf, citing the existence of the trust and demanding, through legal channels, an independent medical evaluation before any temporary order could be granted. He also did something I did not expect, and did not fully understand the strategic weight of until much later. He requested, formally, that the court appoint what is called a guardian ad litem, an independent investigator whose sole job is to visit the person at the center of a guardianship petition and report back to the judge, with no loyalty to either side, exactly what they observe. Judges trust their own eyes and ears, Eleanor, Warren told me over the phone, his voice steady in the particular way of a man who had spent 40 years learning exactly how courtrooms actually worked, beneath all their formal language. Dr. Voss's paperwork is just paper, but if a neutral investigator walks into your kitchen and finds a sharp, articulate woman balancing her own checkbook and running her own household, that becomes very hard for anyone to argue away. The court granted the request, reluctantly, according to Diane's attorney, who apparently argued that an investigator was unnecessary given Dr. Voss's existing findings. A woman named Patricia Yang was assigned to my case, a soft-spoken but sharp-eyed guardian ad litem who had, Warren told me privately, a reputation across the county for catching exactly the kind of engineered incapacity Marisol had first suspected in my own kitchen. I want to tell you honestly that I was terrified the morning Patricia Yang arrived at my door, 12 days before the scheduled hearing, with a clipboard and a manner so carefully neutral I could not read a single opinion on her face. I had spent months being told, in 100 small ways, that I could no longer be trusted to know my own mind, And some cruel, quiet part of me had begun, despite everything Marisol and Warren had shown me, to wonder whether they might be right after all, whether grief and age had truly hollowed something out of me that I simply could not see myself. Patricia Yang sat across from me at my kitchen table for nearly 2 hours. She asked me about my finances, and I walked her through my checkbook, my investment statements, and the exact monthly cost of maintaining my house, all from memory, numbers I had tracked my entire adult life. She asked me about my medications, and I told her, plainly, that I had recently stopped an evening sedative I had never consented to in writing, and that my memory and clarity had improved measurably since. She asked me about my relationship with my daughter, and this was the only moment in 2 hours of careful, composed answers where my voice cracked slightly. Because grief does not disappear simply because you have learned to be strategic about it. I love my daughter, I told Patricia Yang, and I meant it even then, even knowing everything I knew. I think somewhere along the way, she convinced herself that taking my life from me was the same thing as taking care of me. I do not believe those are the same thing at all, and I would like the chance to prove that to a judge, rather than have it decided for me by a doctor who has examined me exactly once. Patricia Yang wrote something down, closed her folder, and thanked me for my time, her expression giving away nothing, the way I imagine a good poker player gives away nothing. And I spent the following 4 days in an agony of uncertainty I would not wish on anyone. Meanwhile, Marisol and I continued building our own case, quietly, carefully, running parallel to whatever Patricia Yang was doing on the court's behalf. It was during this stretch of days that the voicemail became important, the one Richard had accidentally left on my house phone 3 weeks earlier, meant for Diane. And I need to tell you exactly what was on it because it became the single piece of evidence that finally, completely, ended this entire scheme. Richard had called my house phone by mistake, dialing an old saved number instead of Diane's cell, apparently believing he had reached his wife directly, and had left a rambling, panicked message meant only for her ears. In it, his voice tight and fast, he said, "Diane, the lender called again. They're saying 60 days or they seize the whole lot. I need you to move on your mother's house faster. I don't care how. We need that conservatorship signed before the bank does anything. If her doctor can just get the paperwork through, we can get a home equity line against the property before anyone's even looking. Just handle her, please. Just handle it." Just handle her. 4 words that answered, finally, completely, every question I had spent months too afraid to ask out loud. I was not a mother to be cared for. I was a problem to be handled, an asset to be liquidated ahead of a bank seizure that had nothing whatsoever to do with my health and everything to do with my son-in-law's failing business. Marisol had saved that voicemail the moment she heard it, forwarding a recording to her own phone before Diane, arriving 20 minutes later, deleted it from the house phone entirely, believing it gone forever. Warren, when I played it for him over the phone, was silent for a long moment, and then he said, quietly, "Eleanor, this changes everything. This is not a family disagreeing about your care. This is fraud." He explained that Richard's voicemail, combined with Marisol's photographed medication logs, her handwritten timeline, my own notebook of dates and conversations, and the newly discovered banking records showing Richard's dealership $143,000 behind on its floor plan loan, painted a picture no judge could reasonably ignore. This was not a case of a confused daughter making difficult decisions out of misplaced concern. This was a documented scheme to manufacture medical incapacity in order to seize an estate ahead of a family's own financial collapse. And it had a paper trail, and a photograph trail, and now an audio trail. All of it pointing in the exact same direction. 9 days before the hearing, Sophie's piano recital arrived exactly as scheduled, small mercies being what they are. And I sat in the third row of a school auditorium that smelled like floor wax and nervous energy. And I watched my granddaughter play a clumsy, beautiful rendition of a piece by Clementi, her tongue poking out of the corner of her mouth in concentration, the exact same way it had when she was 4 years old and learning to tie her shoes. Diane sat 2 seats away from me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. And for 90 minutes, watching our girl, we were simply, uncomplicatedly, a mother and a grandmother sharing a proud moment. And it broke my heart more than almost anything else that had happened in the previous 17 days. Because I could see, so clearly, the version of my daughter that still existed somewhere underneath everything she had chosen to become. After the recital, Sophie ran to me first, the way she always did, and wrapped her arms around my waist and said, "Grandma, did you hear the part I almost messed up?" And I told her, honestly, that I had not heard a single mistake, only a girl who loved music enough to play it imperfectly and beautifully anyway. And over the top of her head, I caught Diane watching us, and for just a moment, her carefully composed expression slipped, and I saw something underneath it that looked almost like shame. It did not stop her. 2 days later, I learned from Warren that Dr. Voss had submitted his final capacity evaluation to the court, formally recommending full guardianship and conservatorship, citing progressive cognitive decline consistent with early dementia, evidenced by memory lapses, financial confusion, and a documented fall resulting in injury. Not one word in his report mentioned the sedative Marisol had identified. Not one word mentioned that he had examined me exactly once for 11 minutes 3 months earlier, and had not seen me since. Shame, it turns out, does not always stop a person from finishing what they started. Sometimes it only makes them move faster, hoping to outrun the moment they might have to feel it fully. 7 days before the hearing, Patricia Yang's report was filed with the court, sealed until the hearing itself, and Warren told me, in a voice carefully controlled to keep his own hope from spilling over into false comfort, that he had heard, through channels he would not fully explain, that her findings were, in his words, very favorable to our side. I allowed myself, for the first time in 17 days, to sleep a full night through without waking at 3 in the morning to check the water stain on my ceiling shaped like Ohio, wondering whether I would still be sleeping in that bed by summer. 6 days before the hearing, Marisol and I sat at my kitchen table one final time before everything would be handed over entirely to lawyers and judges and courtroom procedure. And she told me something I have carried with me ever since. "You remind me of my grandmother," she said. "Not because you're frail, because you're not. Consuelo never stopped being sharp, not for one single day. The only thing that ever made her look confused was what they put in her food. You were never the problem here, Mrs. Hartwell. You were only ever the target." I reached across that table, the same table, always the same table, and took her hand, the hand that had shaken the morning she spilled 42 pills across it, and finally told me the truth. And I told her that whatever happened in that courtroom, she had already given me back something no judge could take away. My own certainty, my own voice. 5 days later, that voice would be tested in front of a room full of strangers, a judge in black robes, a court reporter typing every word, and the daughter I had raised sitting across the aisle from me, still, even then, believing she would win. I did not sleep well the night before the hearing, though not for the reasons I had feared when I first heard about the emergency motion 3 weeks earlier. I was not afraid. Not in the way I had been afraid then, lying awake and staring at a water stain shaped like Ohio, wondering whether I was imagining a plot against my own life. That fear had transformed, somewhere over the previous 17 days, into something steadier and colder. The particular sleeplessness of a woman who has already done everything within her power, and now simply has to wait for the machinery of a courtroom to catch up with the truth. Warren called me at 8 o'clock that final evening, his voice carrying the exhausted, wired energy of a man who had spent the entire day cross-referencing bank records with Marisol's handwritten timeline, building what he called, with a small, tired laugh, the tightest case I have put together in 20 years, and I built it in 17 days instead of 17 months. He walked me through the order of witnesses one final time, patiently, the way a good teacher repeats a lesson not because the student has forgotten it, but because repetition itself is a kind of comfort. Dr. Voss will testify first, because Foster believes his medical credentials will set the tone for everything that follows, Warren said. Then Diane. Foster wants the court to see a devoted daughter before anyone raises a single hard question. I will cross-examine both of them, and Eleanor, I need you to understand something important. You do not have to say a single word tomorrow unless the judge asks you something directly. Your silence is not weakness in that room. It is strategy. Let the evidence do the speaking. Your daughter spent 2 years trying to convince everyone you could no longer do. I told him I understood, though some part of me, some old and stubborn part that had spent 48 years balancing checkbooks, and 46 years running a household, and 71 years simply being alive, wanted very badly to stand up in that courtroom and say every single thing I had swallowed since the night Diane first called to ask whether I had thought about downsizing. Warren, as though he had heard that wanting through the phone line itself, said gently, "Save it, Eleanor. If it comes to it, you'll get your moment. But let them hang themselves with their own rope first." After I hung up with Warren, the phone rang again almost immediately, and for one unsettled second I feared it might be Diane, calling to say something cutting or something desperate. I could not have said which frightened me more. But the screen showed Sophie's name instead, and I answered it with a relief that nearly undid the careful composure I had spent all evening building. "Grandma," she said, "Mom said you have a meeting tomorrow. A really important one. Is it about grown-up stuff?" I sat down on the small phone bench in the hallway, the same bench where I had once found Walter's cream-colored card tucked inside an old envelope, and I chose my words to a 9-year-old as carefully as Warren had chosen his instructions to a jury of one judge. "It is about grown-up stuff, sweetheart," I told her. "But I want you to know something, and I want you to remember it, whatever happens tomorrow. Your grandfather built this house with his own 2 hands, board by board, because he believed a strong foundation could outlast almost anything the world threw at it. I still believe that. And I am going to make sure that whatever you inherit from this family someday is a house built on truth, not on convenience. Does that make sense to you?" Sophie was quiet for a moment, the particular thoughtful quiet of a child working hard to understand something just beyond the edge of her own experience. "I think so," she said finally. "Is Mom in trouble?" I told her, honestly, that her mother had made some choices that a lot of grown-ups were going to have to sort out tomorrow, and that whatever happened, my love for Sophie herself would never once be part of what got sorted. She seemed satisfied by that, the way children often are satisfied by honesty delivered gently, even when the full truth is kept just out of reach, and she told me she loved me, and that she would practice her piano piece one more time before bed in case I needed something happy to think about tomorrow. And I hung up the phone with tears standing in my eyes that were not, for once, tears of grief. I spent the last hour before bed doing something almost ceremonial, laying out the charcoal dress I intended to wear the next morning across the foot of my bed, the same dress I had worn to Walter's funeral 3 years earlier, pressed and ready in the closet ever since. Waiting, I suppose, without my ever consciously planning it, for exactly this kind of occasion, a day when I needed to look like a woman entirely in control of her own dignity. I set out my good shoes beside it, the low-heeled ones Walter always said made me look like I meant business, and I placed, on top of the dresser where I would see it first thing in the morning, the small, cream-colored business card with his handwriting on the back. 7 words that had carried me through the worst 17 days of my life since his death. I lay in bed a long while after the lights went out, listening to the house settle around me the way it always did, the particular creaks and sighs of a structure built by a man who understood exactly how wood moves and breathes over decades. And I thought about how strange it was that the very walls sheltering me that night were themselves evidence in the case being argued the next morning. The house itself standing as a kind of silent witness to everything Walter had built and everything Diane and Richard now wanted to dismantle. I thought, too, about the version of Diane I had glimpsed at Sophie's recital 9 days earlier, her shoulder nearly touching mine, both of us simply, uncomplicatedly proud of the same small girl for 90 unbroken minutes. I did not know, lying there in the dark, whether that version of my daughter would appear again tomorrow, whether some fragment of the girl who used to climb into my lap and ask for her hair to be braided might resurface under the weight of a courtroom and a judge's sworn oath to find the truth. I hoped for it, even then, even knowing everything I knew. Hope, I have come to understand, does not always require optimism. Sometimes it only requires love that refuses to fully give up, even on the people who have given every reason to be given up on. I woke at 5 the next morning, well before my alarm, in the particular alert stillness of a person whose body has decided, on its own, that sleep has served its purpose, and it is now time to prepare for battle. I made coffee, black, the way Dr. Voss's notes still technically forbade, and I drank it slowly at my kitchen table, the same table that had held 42 spilled pills and a whispered warning. The same table where Marisol and I had built our case morning after morning. The same table where I had once written, in my own careful hand, 3 words to myself in a moment of quiet, private resolve. I will fight. Marisol arrived at 6:30 that morning, not for her usual shift, since Diane had quietly stopped scheduling her visits the moment the emergency motion was filed, but as a friend, driving over in her gray sedan with the rosary still swinging from the mirror, to sit with me for 20 minutes before Warren arrived to take us both to the courthouse together. She brought a small paper bag of pan dulce from a bakery near her apartment, and we ate it standing at my kitchen counter in a silence that needed no filling. 2 women who had built something quiet and formidable together, out of 42 spilled pills, and a shared, unspoken understanding of exactly what it costs a family to decide an old woman is more useful erased than loved. However it goes today, Marisol said, brushing sugar from her fingers. You already won something they can never take back. You stopped believing them before you had any proof at all. That takes a kind of courage most people never find until it's too late. I held on to that sentence the entire drive to the Millbrook County Probate Court, sitting in the back seat of Warren's sedan while he drove with both hands steady on the wheel, and his jaw set in the particular determined line I remembered from Walter's funeral, when he had carried my husband's casket without once letting his hand shake, despite everything else in him trembling. The morning outside was crisp and clear, the kind of early spring morning that makes a person believe, foolishly perhaps, that clean weather might be some small omen of a clean outcome. And I watched the familiar streets of Millbrook slide past the window. The hardware store where Walter had bought lumber for 40 years. The elementary school where Diane herself had once learned to read. The small park where I had pushed her on a swing set as a girl who still, back then, believed her mother could fix anything simply by being present. Diane, I would learn only much later, had spent that same morning at her own kitchen table, 40 minutes across town, telling Richard over coffee that she felt for the first time in weeks entirely confident, certain that Dr. Voss's paperwork and Foster's smooth courtroom presence would carry the day exactly as planned. Certain that whatever quiet resistance her mother had managed to organize in 17 short days could not possibly outmatch months of careful legal preparation. She had no idea what was coming for her. The Millbrook County Probate Court occupied the second floor of a squat brick building that had once been a post office, and I remember walking up its worn stone steps on the morning of the hearing, thinking that my whole life had somehow narrowed down to this single hallway, this single door, this single wooden bench outside courtroom 2, where Warren Kessler sat beside me in a gray suit that had clearly been tailored decades ago, and worn only for occasions exactly like this one. I wore, that morning, a simple charcoal dress I had not worn since Walter's funeral, the only formal thing I owned that felt appropriately serious. And I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror an hour before we left, smoothing the fabric over my hips, and thinking that Walter would have told me I looked exactly like a woman who knew precisely what she was worth. I needed to believe that, walking into that courthouse, because everything about the building, the fluorescent lighting, the metal detector at the entrance, the hush of the hallway, seemed designed to make a person feel small, exactly the way 17 days of Diane's careful campaign had been designed to make me feel small. And I refused, absolutely refused, to give either of them the satisfaction. Diane arrived 20 minutes after we did, walking beside Richard in a cream-colored suit that looked expensive in the specific way clothing looks expensive when you can no longer actually afford it. And beside them walked their attorney, a tall, brisk man named Foster, who carried a leather briefcase and an expression of total, untroubled confidence. Diane did not look at me in the hallway. She looked past me, through me, the way you look at a piece of furniture you have already mentally sold. Dr. Voss arrived last, 10 minutes before the hearing began, in a rumpled sport coat, and I watched him shake Foster's hand with the easy familiarity of two men who had done business together many times before. And I thought about Richard's dealership sending workers' comp claims to that same office for years. And I thought about how thin, how remarkably thin, the wall between medicine and convenience can become when enough money is quietly involved. Judge Miriam Castellano called the hearing to order at 9:15 that morning. A woman in her early 60s with silver-streaked hair pulled back severely and reading glasses perched low on her nose. And I remember thinking, the moment she looked up from her file and surveyed the room, that here, finally, sitting behind that bench, was a person whose entire professional life had been built on the exact skill I most desperately needed in that moment. The ability to separate what a person claims from what is actually true. Foster went first, laying out Diane's petition with the smooth, rehearsed confidence of an attorney who believed, genuinely believed, that he had already won. He described my fall in October, my subsequent confusion, the missing money from my checking account, and Dr. Voss's formal diagnosis of progressive cognitive decline. He described Diane not as a woman seizing an estate, but as a devoted daughter forced by circumstance into an impossible role, protecting a mother who could no longer protect herself. He called Dr. Voss to the stand first, and for nearly 20 minutes, Dr. Voss described, in clinical, detached language, the symptoms he claimed to have observed during his single 11-minute evaluation 3 months earlier. When Warren rose for cross-examination, I felt Diane's eyes finally, truly land on me for the first time that morning, and I did not look away. "Dr. Voss," Warren began, his voice mild, almost conversational, the voice of a man in no particular hurry. "How many times in total have you personally examined Mrs. Hartwell?" "Once," Dr. Voss said, "following her fall." "And in that single 11-minute examination," Warren continued, "did you review her prior medical history with her longtime physician, Dr. Alvarez, who had treated her for 11 years? Dr. Voss hesitated. "I reviewed the referral notes provided to me." "Provided to you by whom?" "By the family," Dr. Voss admitted, and I watched Judge Castellano's pen pause very briefly above her notepad. Warren walked him, methodically, patiently, board by board, the way Walter used to frame a wall, through the prescription he had written, the sedative with no clear post-concussion indication, the absence of any follow-up examination in 3 full months, despite recommending a guardianship that would strip a woman of every legal right she possessed, and the referral relationship between his practice and Richard's dealership, a relationship Dr. Voss tried, unsuccessfully, to describe as merely coincidental. "One final question, Doctor," Warren said, and something in his voice shifted, tightened, the sound of a man laying the final board across a foundation he had spent 17 days pouring. "Are you aware that Mrs. Hartwell discontinued the sedative you prescribed, of her own accord, 6 weeks ago?" Dr. Voss's face went very still. "I was not aware of that." "Would it surprise you to learn," Warren continued, "that her memory, her clarity, and her ability to manage her own finances have measurably, verifiably improved since that date, exactly as you would expect if the sedative itself had been contributing to the symptoms you diagnosed as permanent cognitive decline?" The courtroom was silent long enough that I could hear the ceiling fan turning overhead, a soft, mechanical hum I had not noticed until that exact moment, and Dr. Voss, staring at a spot somewhere on the polished wooden table in front of him, said nothing at all, which, in that room, in that silence, said absolutely everything. Foster called Diane to the stand next, and I watched my daughter walk to the witness chair in her expensive cream suit, chin lifted, still, even then, believing her performance could carry the day. She described, in a voice thick with what sounded, to anyone who did not know her the way I knew her, like genuine anguish, how difficult it had been to watch her mother decline, how much she loved me, how every decision she had made came from a place of pure, exhausted concern. I let her finish. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded in my lap the way I had once folded them in church pews as a girl, and I let every word land, because I understood by then that the truth I carried in Warren's folder did not need my anger to be effective. It only needed the room. When Warren rose to cross-examine his own daughter's testimony, his voice remained gentle, almost sorrowful, the voice of a man who had genuinely hoped it would not come to this. "Mrs. Prescott," he said, "I'd like to play a voicemail for the court, recovered from Mrs. Hartwell's home telephone, dated April the 14th. Foster objected immediately, loudly, citing improper authentication. But Judge Castellano, after a brief review of the chain of custody documentation Warren had prepared with meticulous care, overruled him. And the recording played through a small speaker set up beside the witness stand. Richard's voice, tight and fast and unmistakable, filling that entire courtroom. "Diane," the lender called again. "They're saying 60 days or they seize the whole lot. I need you to move on your mother's house faster. I don't care how. We need that conservatorship signed before the bank does anything. If her doctor can just get the paperwork through, we can get a home equity line against the property before anyone's even looking. Just handle her, please. Just handle it. Just handle her." I watched my daughter's face while that recording played, and I want to tell you honestly that I felt no triumph in that moment, only a deep, aching sorrow. Because I watched, in real time, the exact instant the mask she had worn for 2 years finally, completely cracked open. Her chin, which had been lifted with such confidence 20 minutes earlier, dropped. Her hands, folded neatly in her lap, began to tremble. And when the recording ended, and the courtroom sat in a silence so total I could hear my own heartbeat, Diane looked at me for the first time all morning, truly looked at me, and whatever she saw in my face, grief, not victory, seemed to undo something in her completely. "Mom," she said, her voice breaking, right there on the witness stand, in front of a judge and a court reporter and her own attorney. "I never wanted to hurt you. Richard said if we didn't move fast, we'd lose everything. And I thought if I could just get control of things before the bank came, I could fix it quietly, and you'd never even have to know how bad it had gotten. And then everything just kept getting bigger, and I didn't know how to stop it." It was, I believe, the first entirely honest sentence my daughter had spoken to me in over a year, and it arrived 4 minutes too late to change anything the court had already heard. Judge Castellano called a brief recess, and when the hearing resumed 40 minutes later, Patricia Yang's sealed report was formally entered into the record, and its findings, read aloud by the court reporter at the judge's request, described me as fully oriented, financially literate, emotionally stable, and entirely capable of managing her own affairs, with documented improvement following the discontinuation of an unnecessary sedative. The report further noted, in careful, measured legal language, significant concerns regarding the circumstances under which the petitioner's medical evaluation was obtained. Judge Castellano removed her reading glasses, set them down on her file, and looked directly at Diane and Richard for a long, uncomfortable moment before she spoke. "I have presided over guardianship petitions for 19 years, she said, "and I want to be very clear about what I am seeing here today. This is not a case of a family struggling to care for a declining parent. This is a documented attempt to manufacture medical incapacity in order to seize control of an estate ahead of a private financial obligation entirely unrelated to Mrs. Hartwell's well-being." She turned a page in her file. "The petition for guardianship and conservatorship is denied, in full." I did not cry in that courtroom, though I wanted to. I sat perfectly still, the way I had sat still for months, and I let 17 days of fear finally, quietly, drain out of my shoulders, and beside me, Warren Kessler exhaled a long breath he seemed to have been holding since Walter's funeral 3 years earlier. Judge Castellano was not finished. She addressed Dr. Voss directly, informing him that a formal referral would be made to the state medical board regarding the circumstances of his evaluation and his undisclosed financial relationship with the petitioner's family. She addressed Foster, noting for the record her concerns about the evidentiary basis of the original petition. And then, finally, she addressed Diane and Richard themselves, her voice losing none of its measured calm, but gaining something harder underneath it. "I am not making any findings today regarding criminal fraud," she said, "as that is not within the scope of this proceeding. But I want both of you to understand, clearly, that the evidence entered into this record today will not simply disappear when you walk out of this courtroom. What you do with the next chapter of your lives and your relationship with your mother is entirely up to you. But you no longer control the narrative in this case. She does." Richard did not speak again for the remainder of the hearing. He sat with his head bowed, his expensive suit suddenly looking, to me, like a costume worn by a much smaller man than the one who had always insisted on picking up the check at Sunday dinners. Diane cried quietly into a tissue Foster handed her, and I watched him lean away from her slightly, the particular retreat of a professional who has just realized his client's story does not hold together the way he'd been told it would. Outside the courthouse, on those same worn stone steps I had climbed that morning, feeling like a woman walking toward her own erasure, Diane caught up to me before I reached the car. Richard hung back by the entrance, on his phone already, and I wondered, distantly, whether he was calling the lender, or a different lawyer, or simply calling someone, anyone, to explain how quickly his plan had come apart in a room full of strangers. "Mom," Diane said, and her voice was smaller than I had heard it in years, smaller even than it had been on the witness stand. "I don't know how to fix this." I looked at my daughter for a long moment, this woman I had raised, taught to ride a bicycle, walked down an aisle, and I thought about every phone call about downsizing, every dinner comment about what was best, every unmarked pill Marisol had photographed and disposed of, every dollar quietly missing from an account I had balanced faithfully for 48 years. And I thought, too, about the recital 9 days earlier, our shoulders nearly touching in that auditorium, both of us simply, uncomplicatedly proud of the same small girl. "I don't know either, Diane," I told her honestly. "But I know it starts with you telling me the whole truth, not the version that protects you. And I know it starts with you understanding that I am not something to be handled. I am your mother, and I raised you better than this. And somewhere in you, I still believe that girl exists." She wept, standing there on those courthouse steps, and I did not fully forgive her that day, because forgiveness, I have learned, is not something you can hand over on command, no matter how badly both people standing on a set of stone steps might want it. But I did not turn away from her either. I told her I loved her, because I did, because I still do. And I told her that love and trust were no longer the same thing in my mind, and that rebuilding trust, if it happened at all, would happen slowly, on my terms, at my pace, exactly the way Walter used to say a foundation has to cure before you can safely build anything on top of it. What happened in the months that followed, I will tell you honestly and completely, because I think the truth of it matters more than a tidy ending would. Richard's dealership was seized by the lender 6 weeks after the hearing, exactly as he had feared, though by then it hardly seemed to matter to him the way it once had. The state medical board opened a formal investigation into Dr. Voss, and I later learned he voluntarily surrendered his license before the investigation concluded, choosing quiet retirement over public accounting. Diane and Richard separated 4 months after the hearing, not because of any single dramatic event, but because, Diane told me during one of our slow, careful, still healing phone calls, she had finally understood that she no longer recognized the man who had once told her to just handle her own mother. I did not celebrate any of that. I want to be clear about that, because this is not a story about punishment satisfying some hunger in me. It is a story about a foundation, cracked nearly to collapse, being carefully, patiently repaired, board by board. The only way Walter ever taught me anything worth keeping could be built. Sophie moved in with me for 6 months during her parents' separation, sleeping in the same room that had once been Diane's own childhood bedroom. And every evening we sat at my kitchen table, the same table, always the same table, and did her homework together. And some evenings, when she asked, I told her the story of the porch swing her grandfather built from a stranger's leftover barnwood. And she listened the way she always had, with her whole small chest. And I understood, watching her, that whatever else had been lost these past 3 years, that particular thread had never broken. Marisol Reyes and I remain close to this day. She left the home care agency 8 months after the hearing, and with a small loan I insisted on giving her, though she resisted fiercely at first, she opened a modest elder advocacy consultancy of her own, helping families identify exactly the kind of quiet, engineered harm she had once found in my kitchen. I was her very first client testimonial, and I gave it gladly, because a woman who kneels beneath a stranger's table and risks her own livelihood to whisper a warning deserves every good thing life still has left to offer her. Diane and I speak now, slowly, carefully, most weeks, and I would be lying if I told you it feels the way it once did, before Walter died, before the calls about downsizing began. It does not. But it is honest now, in a way it was not for 2 long years, and honesty, I have come to believe, is worth more than the comfortable performance of closeness we had settled for instead. I still live in the house Walter built on Maple Ridge Lane. I still climb his handrail every single day, sanded smooth by his own patient hands, and I have never once fallen on those stairs again. The trust he quietly built for me, without ever telling me, still holds, exactly as he designed it, a foundation poured long before either of us knew how badly it would one day be needed. If there is one thing I want you to carry away from my story tonight, it is this. The people who count on your silence are almost never counting on your strength, because they have convinced themselves, somewhere along the way, that you no longer have any left. Do not let anyone, not a doctor, not a lawyer, not even your own child, decide for you what you are and are not still capable of. Ask questions. Keep your own records. Trust the quiet, persistent voice in your own chest that tells you something is wrong, long before anyone hands you proof. Have you ever had to fight to be believed by the people who were supposed to protect you? Have you ever had to stand your ground against your own family, quietly, patiently, one careful step at a time? Tell me your story in the comments below, because I promise you, someone else reading this tonight needs to hear that they are not alone in it. And if this story meant something to you, if it reminded you even a little of your own strength, or your own mother's, or your own grandmother's, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe, so that stories like mine, and like Marisol's grandmother Consuelo's, keep finding their way to the people who need them most. I was never the confused old woman they needed me to be. I was only ever waiting for someone brave enough to hand me back my own truth.